Creepy modern mysteries that are still unsolved. Most people don't realize how common mysteries are. Honestly, if you pay attention, you'll find mysteries all around us. Just the other day, I was sitting at a cafe when I lost one of my most prized possessions. I left my hat on my seat as I went to the bathroom for maybe 2 minutes. But when I got back, my hat was gone. But the weirdest part was that the cafe was full of people and not a single person saw who took my hat. Luckily, I have a lot of hats, and in the grand scheme of things, that wasn't really a hard mystery to figure out. But not all mysteries are as easy to crack. In fact, today I've compiled a list of mysterious crimes, events, entities, and other unsolved mysteries so perplexing that to this day they remain unsolved. And as always, this list gets scarier as it goes on. Number 1, the missing wrecking ball. In 1974, workers for the Dowling Construction Company in Indianapolis left their crane to go home, just like any other day. As usual, the 5-ton steel wrecking ball remained hanging from this crane about 200 feet in the air. The next morning, the entire wrecking ball was flat out gone. And no, it hadn't fallen to the ground, it was gone from the entire site. The whole town, along with police, were baffled by this bizarre theft and that the wrecking ball was never found. Apparently, some people criticized them for leaving the wrecking ball like that, but I mean, what else are you supposed to do? Detach the wrecking ball and roll it into a giant adamantium safe for good keeping? Also, what's the motive for stealing a 5-ton wrecking ball? According to my research, 5 tons of steel is only worth about $800. Imagine going through all of the effort of stealing a 5-ton wrecking ball and still not having enough money to afford 9 grams of gold. Part of me wonders if the reason this case went cold is because nobody really cared. I mean, if I had to spend more time tracking down a defective wrecking ball on the loose than completing the construction project with my crew, I'd probably just forget it too. I'd like to think that everyone just assumed that somehow the cable cut itself loose and the ball comically rolled 2 miles down the road at night off a cliff into the ocean. The worst part about this case is the more I researched it, the more mysterious it became. If you look up this company, you'll find that they're pretty much only known for losing this wrecking ball. And in one newspaper from the same time period, I was able to find a story with an interview from the owner of the company who lost the ball. The funniest part about the story is that Lauren Dowling, the owner of the Dowling Construction Company, said, and I quote, "I can't figure out what someone would want to do with a 5-ton metal ball." Then another newspaper I found provided a couple more details in the story. In this paper, an interviewer named Beck Walter asked someone who knew about the story personally, "Is this story true? If so, when and where did it happen? Was the ball ever found?" Then, Sincero, the man she was interviewing, said, "It's true," according to Lauren Dowling, owner of the firm. His workers were tearing down and erecting a boys' club on the Indianapolis South Side during the summer of 1974. Just like your book says, the huge ball was hanging about 200 feet in the air from a crane at the end of the workday, and was gone 8 hours later when the workers returned. The crane didn't appear to be tampered with, said Dowling, but the ball was never recovered. What's also strange about this case is that no leads for any potential suspects were ever found, which is confusing considering you would probably need to run some seriously loud equipment in order to manage carrying a steel ball the weight of multiple cars away in the middle of the night. On top of this, the thieves left no tire tracks. Also, it didn't look like the thieves had tampered with the crane, and the wrecking ball didn't seem to have fallen because there was no crater on the ground where it would have landed. If you're open to some pretty crazy conclusions, I found some people on a mystery forum theorizing that some type of interdimensional time traveler from the future somehow teleported the wrecking ball into a different universe to save someone from a Final Fantasy style incident that was destined to kill them. So, yeah. All in all, no matter how you choose to interpret the story, although this is a tame example, the story is still rather strange. Number 2, kidnapped by Sasquatch. Nowadays, when we hear about Bigfoot, we typically laugh, but that's only because we were born in the modern day. Today, Bigfoot has become a meme, but this is only because most people in the modern era live in a town, city, or some sort of civilization that is not so rural. But for those in the past or even today who still live deep in the woods, woodland creatures are nothing to laugh at. It's easy to laugh at a mysterious creature when you're deep in the city, surrounded by humans living in a concrete building, but it's not so easy to laugh at a creature of the woods when you live in a wooden house in the middle of nowhere and you realize the creature you fear so deeply could tear the roof off of your house. These stories are stories of people alone, surrounded by woods, with truly no idea what lies beyond their small house's boundaries. When you're deep in the woods, you truly have no idea what's out there. Technology won't be there to save you. And in the times that these historic accounts took place, there was no GPS, no walkie-talkie, and no phone. The only satellites flying around Earth at this point were lonely, barren asteroids. And if you got lost in the woods, the question wasn't what your odds of dying were, it was what your odds of living were. In this time, a man had to come face to face with his own natural habitat and anything that dwells within it. When I tell you of these accounts, you have to keep in mind that these aren't just urban folklore. They are actual published accounts that resulted from real-life adventures before the internet and before safety. Also, there weren't cities and towns populating almost every area of the Earth like there are today. So if you were alone in the wilderness, at times the empty asteroid orbiting you in space was closer to you than the nearest human. What most modern day people forget is that the concept of Bigfoot or Sasquatch came from multiple real-life accounts from real people who often came across Bigfoot face to face. Before I begin this story, I want to preface it with an interesting fact. According to historical accounts, Albert Ostman, the man who had this strange encounter, refused to tell anyone his story for many years because, in his words, he didn't think that anybody would believe him. To be honest, if I had something as crazy as the story I'm about to tell you happen to me, I wouldn't think anyone would believe me either. Nevertheless, many of the details in his description ended up being consistent with other similar accounts of creatures in the same area that came out later. Keep in mind that this was long before the internet, and it's pretty unlikely that Albert was able to communicate with the others who came out with similar descriptions later on. In 1924, Albert Ostman, who was a logger and construction worker, had a vacation. When people in our era, the modern day, think of going on vacation, we imagine going on a cruise, or maybe going to the beach, or maybe even staying at a nice lake house. But Albert was an absolute mad lad, and his idea of a vacation was searching for a lost gold mine, rumored to be at the head of the Toba Inlet in British Columbia. In all honesty, I wish I was this cool. Sasquatch or not, deciding that for your vacation, you're gonna trek through the wilderness alone, looking for a lost gold mine like you're Indiana Jones, has to be one of the more badass things I've heard in a long time. Also, sometimes I forget before video games, people just used to do badass things because they just felt like it. There was no social media, no online approval for doing something cool, nothing. People like this guy just did real life side quests because they felt like it. Anyways, apparently when he was on his way to the supposed area, an old Indian boatman warned him about, quote, huge, hairy, big people living in the mountains near the abandoned mine he was looking for. But he just shrugged it off, saying that he, quote, refused to believe old Indian fables about mountain giants. Once he finally got to the inlet where the gold mine was supposedly close to, he left the Indian boatman and started hiking. According to his account, all he brought with him was his rifle, pack sack of food, cooking utensils, sleeping bag, and a ground sheet. After hiking for about a week, he settled down at a camping spot between two big trees that happened to be next to a freshwater spring. For Albert, this campsite was perfect, except for the fact that every morning it appeared that someone or something had rummaged through his supplies and taken all of his food. Albert, being the mad lad we knew he was, instead of being scared and going home or just being plain upset, he made a plan. He climbed into his sleeping bag fully clothed with his rifle right next to him so he could attack whoever or whatever was stealing his food. Like many of us at the sleepover, Albert was the first to fall asleep, and what he woke up to was insane. I was awakened, he wrote, by something picking me up. I was half asleep, and at first I did not remember where I was. As I began to get my wits together, I remembered that I was on a prospecting trip and in my sleeping bag. My first thought was it must be a snowslide, but there was no snow around my camp. Then it felt like I was tossed on horseback, but I could feel whatever it was walking. According to Albert, the creature was carrying him in his sleeping bag, kind of like a DoorDash delivery guy, but not just for a few minutes. For hours. Albert apparently tried cutting his way through the bag that he was being carried in, but he was in such an awkward position in the bag that he couldn't get his knife out of his pocket. After a couple hours, the creature dropped him down, and he heard multiple creatures talking to each other in a weird language that he couldn't understand. At dawn, he finally mustered up the courage to struggle out of his bag and found 4 people who were, quote, covered in hair and wearing no clothes at all. Finally, he realized that the Indian guy on the boat who tried to warn him was right. These were the Sasquatches. As the sun came up, he saw that he was in a valley with mountains all around, and it became apparent to him that the 4 people were some type of Sasquatch family. According to Albert, there was, quote, an old man, old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. These creatures didn't do anything to hurt him, but it seemed clear through their behavior that they were, as Albert put it, intent on keeping him. Interestingly, the guy in this story states that he thought that they were human, although they had almost inhuman proportions. This is a summarized quote of what Albert saw. The young fellow might have been between 11 and 18 years old, about 7 feet tall, and might weigh about 300 pounds. He had a wide jaw and a narrow forehead that slanted upward. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long. The hair on the rest of their body was short and thick in places. The woman was over 7 feet tall. She could have weighed about 500 to 600 pounds. She had very wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. The man's canines were longer than the rest of his teeth, but not long enough to be called tusks. The old man must have been near 8 feet tall, big barrel chest, and a big hump on his back and shoulders. His forearms were longer than common people, but well proportioned. His fingers were short in proportion to the rest of his hands, but his fingernails were like chisels. After living with the Sasquatch family for 6 days, Albert hilariously got tired of being around them, which makes sense, considering he had basically become the family pet for this Sasquatch family. Once he decided he was going to escape, he waited until none of them were paying attention to him. He reached for his gun, fired his rifle in the air, and in doing this, he was able to startle the family enough to make a run for it and navigate back to the inlet. Albert, of course, made it out and lived to tell the tale. And after this story, I'm probably gonna think twice about going camping alone, or even at all. With this being one of the earlier and most documented and validated Sasquatch stories, the level of detail and sheer circumstance is rather questionable and definitely scary. Were the Sasquatch real? Was he kidnapped? Did he have some sort of psychedelic experience? Was it aliens? Was it all a lie? We'll likely never know. Number 3. A slip in time. In 1901, 2 English school teachers named Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were on a holiday trip in France. On this trip, they visited the historic site known as the Palace of Versailles. According to the 2 of them, they both claimed to have the exact same experience. At some point in their walk, they found themselves over 100 years back in time. They found the Petit Trianon, a small manor house given to Marie Antoinette by Louis XVI, and reportedly saw it exactly how it looked when it was new in 1792. Apparently, they had been taken back to this very specific day for a reason, because according to the school teachers, the day they were taken back to was August 10th, 1792, which was the same historic day that the royal family was forced to flee the palace. The 2 teachers claimed to have walked on historic pathways that no longer existed and saw people in old-fashioned clothing accurate to the year they were in all around them. The craziest part is that they claimed to have seen Marie Antoinette herself, who was painting in the garden. Apparently, Marie Antoinette looked up at them from the painting and just stared at them, never saying a word. The 2 teachers didn't really think much about this the day that it happened. Only upon coming back to the site years later after seeing paintings of Marie Antoinette and studying the layout of the palace, they had realized that the palace they were exploring in 1901 was not from 1901. Skeptics of this story claimed that they must have just walked into a costume party that day, but no historical record was ever found of there being a costume party on that specific day. Despite skepticism, the 2 ladies stood their ground until their death. Part of me just thinks somewhere at this museum site, there was some sort of 19th century hippie working there, and when he saw 2 school teachers getting ready for their afternoon tea, he slipped in a little Salvinorin B methyloxymethyl ether. Jokes aside, this is either the craziest thing I've ever heard or the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and there is no in between. The 2 interpretations of this story are: 1, 2 half-drunken school teachers stumbled into a Marie Antoinette costume party or some sort of play and thought that the actor playing Marie Antoinette was actually Marie Antoinette. Or secondly, 2 school teachers were walking around a historical site and accidentally walked right into the entrance of a wormhole at the exact time some type of interdimensional being opened it up to transfer time periods, sending them back past the back rooms and right into the year 1792. Then the interdimensional time traveling entity was sweating bullets because normal humans were not supposed to be able to get this back in time. So the creature had to go back to the same day, find the 2 teachers, and bring them back into the present day before they talked to the queen and ruined the entire space-time continuum. But because the women had already changed the present day due to the butterfly effect, the interdimensional entity either had to find another timeline in which the present was congruent with everything they did in 1792 and send them to the universal timeline that we exist today, where I'm telling you the story right now. And putting it that way, I'm starting to think it's just a costume party. But I do find it extremely eerie that one day you can be walking through a building and appreciating its beauty and seeing somebody you thought you recognized, only to later be looking in a history book and realize that you were in a building that was almost 200 years older than you thought, and the person you thought you recognized was Marie Antoinette. Number 4. Unidentified creatures at the mine. Before I start the story, I just want to mention that there seems to be some sort of weird correlation between mine shafts and mysterious forest creatures. This is just a theory, but I'm starting to think that special interest groups who want a certain mining territory for themselves would just put on a costume of some sort to scare away the other prospectors from thinking about working there. Either way, this next story is wild to say the least. In 1924, American miners in Ape Canyon were staying on the east side of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. One morning, deep in the woods, Fred Beck and his group of prospectors saw something that baffled them. Around the cabin they had just slept in, they noticed huge human-like footprints that appeared to have been walking around their cabin that night. The worst part about this is this wasn't the first time. The other times this had happened, the prospectors shrugged it off, as if maybe another crew member was playing a prank on them. I mean, other explanations just didn't make sense. Their cabin wasn't in a town, and as far as Mr. Beck knew, there wasn't anybody else around. Weird. But the men carried on with their day, trying not to think about it too much. After a couple of weeks went by with no strange occurrences to be seen, Beck and most of his crew were feeling less tense. I guess it hadn't been a big deal after all, but Beck couldn't shrug this feeling, the feeling that him and his crew were being watched. Then, one day, they were caught off guard. Sitting on a log and eating lunch, one of the men joked about his friend slipping and nearly falling on a squirrel. Beck, lost in laughter, looked to the side to catch his breath, and in an instant he froze. Cold adrenaline coursed through his head, and his stomach felt like a dagger had been plunged into it. For a split second, Beck thought it was a man, but what he processed next made him mildly dissociate for a second, and he even questioned if he was in a dream. Creepily peeking behind a tree was a huge man-like creature, but it definitely wasn't human. At least 8 feet tall and looking only partially human, it stood there, intently, silently watching them. Immediately, one single question pulsed across Beck's mind. How long has it been watching us? In only a moment, the crew had caught on to what he was looking at, and immediately froze along with him, before quickly shooting multiple shots. One of them hit the creature somewhere in the head and it ran away, seeming to be injured. Another day, Fred Beck walked up on a similar creature standing by the edge of a canyon. Getting more and more frustrated at his own growing fear, he shot the creature in the back, and it keeled over and fell off the cliff. But when the men looked down towards the bottom of the cliff to get a better look at it, they couldn't see it anywhere. That night, however, Fred would soon regret his actions, because little did Fred know that whatever those things were, they would soon seek retribution. You see, by now, most of his crew had abandoned the assignment. They came here to be surveyors and miners. Nobody was getting paid any hazard pay to risk their lives being around these mysterious half-human creatures that wouldn't stop following them. With only a few men that night in his cabin, Fred was awakened, and he wrote, quote, "At least 2 creatures attacked our cabin that night, battering the roof and walls in an attempt to break in. The creatures were able to break a hole in between 2 logs of the cabin. All the while, large thundering strikes could be heard from their rooftop in an attempt to break a hole through it. Luckily, our cabin and its roof were built strong enough to resist snowfall. Even after we made repeated shots out of the cabin hole, the creatures violently persisted, at times wedging their huge hands in between the holes in an attempt to yank our cabin walls apart. 5 hours of relentless beating on the cabin later, the creatures gave up and left the site. Outside, the prospectors found the ground torn up with huge footprints all around. After this, Fred and his crew left for good, abandoning their mine, their cabin, and the mining area entirely. Fred had a pretty high tolerance for many things throughout his life in the mining business, but this was not one of them. All in all, the series of events has never been explained, nor did Fred or his crew ever get a photo of the mysterious creature. The most plausible explanation is this was probably a remote tribe of some type, but that wouldn't explain all of their inhuman characteristics. Either way, if I was Fred, I would have been packing my bags 2 minutes after the first encounter. So props at him for carrying on with his job even after most of his crew left. I'm not sure if he's extremely brave or extremely dumb, but regardless, he's got bigger balls than me and a crazy mystery that's still unsolved. Number 5, killed by a chicken. This story really demonstrates the power belief can have on your body. Deep within the Congo in 1682, an Italian missionary named Father Jerome heard an interesting story about a man who died from his own superstition. During the missionary journey, a young local from the Congo, who we'll just call Zuri, had a sleepover with his friend. Then, in the morning, his friend caught a wild hen and made it for breakfast. Now, for some context, according to the superstitions of the local tribes in the area, young people were absolutely forbidden to eat a wild hen. Now, back to Zuri. When he saw the chicken for breakfast, he asked his friend if it was a wild hen or a farmer's hen. Zuri's friend really didn't feel like going out to find another hen to make, so he lied to Zuri, telling him it was a farmer's hen, when in reality, it was a wild hen. Here's the crazy part. Multiple years later, when the two friends met again, Zuri's friend asked him if he wanted to eat a wild hen. Zuri said, "Are you kidding? I was solemnly warned by a magician to never eat a wild hen." The friend immediately laughed and said, "Why wouldn't you? You ate the wild hen I served you last time we hung out." Then, according to multiple reports, Zuri started shaking like Fregley after eating too many jelly beans and was dead within 24 hours. To me, this is definitely a mystery, because even when people know that they're going to die, they very rarely just keel over and die out of fear. But because he ended up dying at some point after he ate the wild hen, would that mean that the magician was actually right? Was the magic of the magician just his power to create a self-fulfilling prophecy? Either way, the magician was definitely onto something here. Or he was just some type of ancient version of a YouTube prankster who just sat around all day busting people's balls and protected himself with the imaginary power of his magic. Either way, finding out you unintentionally broke a rule to only die later that day is extremely strange and, to me, terrifying. And the fact that this situation was well documented and never solved is rather curious. Number 6. The disappearance of Emma Fillipoff. Emma Fillipoff's disappearance is definitely hard to explain. Neither she nor her explanation have been conclusively found. To be honest, this is quite a sad story. And although there are multiple ways to interpret the story, I'll let you decide at the end. Emma Fillipoff was born in 1986 to a family from Ontario, Canada. Her parents divorced at a young age and she was forced to frequently travel to different locations to see her mother and father. Emma was a free spirit. She enjoyed the arts, music, literature, and even took a job teaching English in China for a year as a young adult. After returning from China and unsuccessfully pursuing a career in photojournalism, she landed in British Columbia where she got a summer job working at Redfish Bluefish restaurant while sleeping on a friend's couch. After her seasonal job ended, she bought a van and converted it into a van life style camper. Then one day, for seemingly no reason, she scrubbed her identity on social media clean, removed all traces of herself from the internet, and called off her 3-month-long relationship. Emma also had a journal in which investigators found a lot of entries about how she felt about her parents since their divorce. Through reading the entries, it became apparent that she was having a hard time dealing with the effects the divorce had on her as a child. Emma had a strained relationship with her parents after her father had an affair with a younger woman. Her mother threatened him with a knife, and Emma called the police on her own mother. Records suggest that that was the primary reason that Emma moved out of her parents' house and really didn't want to go back. Personally, I don't blame her. Now, at this point, what's confusing about Emma's story is that she decided to move into a homeless shelter for women, which, if you know anything about homeless shelters, was probably a rougher environment to live in than one of her parents' houses. What's even stranger is at this point when she was living in British Columbia, she had enough money from her restaurant job to rent a decent apartment. But even if she didn't have that money for the apartment, she had an entire renovated van to live in, but apparently she mostly just used it for storage. Now, nobody really knows why she did this, but some theories are that she had undiagnosed paranoia, which made her van feel unsafe. Another possible theory is that she was trying to keep her savings to travel later, which there is some evidence for. Regardless of the fact that she was able to save money at the shelter, Emma was consistently paranoid and anxious at the shelter as well. Staff members allegedly reported that one time she took the furniture and appliances out of her room because they were, quote, telling her things at night. But to be fair, these claims have been contested by others who say that the staff just wanted to portray Emma as a crazy, mentally ill individual in order to alleviate themselves of any personal responsibility. One strange thing about Emma is that it seemed as if she couldn't make her mind up about anything. For example, a couple days before her disappearance, she hired a truck driver to tow her camper van back to Ontario from British Columbia. But the day he showed up, she quickly changed her mind and claimed that she didn't have the money to do it. Then, to make matters stranger, 2 days after this, she called her mother and said she wanted to come home, urgently asking her mom to fly in and come get her. Then, just a couple hours later, she called her mom again to tell her that she changed her mind and wasn't coming home anymore, telling her mom, quote, "I don't know how to face you." Considering how ominous and vague this sentence was, Emma's mother was concerned about her daughter's seemingly erratic behavior, so she booked a flight herself that day to come and help her daughter. After this, her unusual behavior continued. For example, Emma bought a prepaid card with $200 on it and a new prepaid phone, which will tie into the story later. One decision that probably haunts both Emma's mother and the staff of the homeless shelter to this day is that Emma's mother called the women's homeless shelter and decided to let them know that she was going to visit. Then, the staff at the homeless shelter decided to tell Emma about her mother's arrival. Emma was reported to have been, quote, horrified and immediately packed up her belongings and left. Tragically, we'll never know if Emma would have been saved if either of these two decisions were never made. I'm no doctor, but in my armchair psychologist opinion, it seems that Emma possibly had PTSD, which is kind of exemplified by the frequency of her paranoia and the flare-ups of trauma that she experiences involving her parents. But that's just a theory, and I could be completely wrong. Shortly after leaving the shelter, she got in a taxi with her belongings in hand and asked to be taken to the airport, only to change her mind in the middle of the ride, once again lying that she didn't have the money for the taxi. We know this is a lie because she had just received a new credit card, and after working at a restaurant, she had $2,400 in savings, which adjusted for today's money is around $3,300. And everyone knows that that's totally enough money for a taxi, unless you're an oblivious looking tourist in Cancun getting in a taxi with Guadalupe, which at that point, you're done for. And Guadalupe, if you're watching this, please give me my $100 back. That ride from the airport to the hotel was literally like 6 minutes. Anyways, later that night, someone who knew Emma found her walking around barefoot in front of the Empress Hotel. He asked her if she was okay, and she unconvincingly told him that she was just waiting for her friend to pick her up. Dennis, who was Emma's friend, wasn't happy with this answer and thought Emma looked distressed, so he called the police. 20 minutes later, the police arrived and asked her a series of questions. It had been said that she was mostly unresponsive, not saying much and just nodding her head yes and no to the questions asked by the officers. That being said, when it became apparent that the police might take her into custody, she mustered the energy to somehow convince the police that she was totally fine after all. After the police left, she immediately walked away from the hotel area and was never seen again. Now, this case is already weird, but what happened afterwards makes the entire case even more strange. Tragically, her mother showed up to Victoria, British Columbia only 3 hours after she was last seen. And unfortunately, she still thought that Emma would be at the shelter, but the staff told her that they hadn't seen her there that day. When it was confirmed that none of her friends knew where she was declared a missing persons by the police. Remember that $200 prepaid card that Emma had bought? Well, a lead opened up when it was used at a gas station not far away. Unfortunately though, it just turned out to be some random guy who eventually confessed to have found it on the street. Later, another suspect was discovered, a man by the name of Julian Heward, who apparently had a romantic interest in Emma. Strangely though, it was confirmed that he saw Emma at 10 a.m. that day, but like everyone else, he reported Emma to have been acting unusual, because when he asked her what she was doing, she just didn't answer. After all of the leads were exhausted, the case went cold. Then, seemingly randomly, about 2 years after she disappeared, a man in a green shirt with a prosthetic leg was reported to have torn down a missing poster of Emma in a restaurant and thrown it on the floor. Right after doing this, he yelled, quote, "It's one of those missing persons posters, except she is not missing. She's my girlfriend, and she ran away because she hates her parents." The staff immediately called the police, who arrived 2 hours later. And to this day, the best possible lead for this case has never been identified. Another interesting piece of the puzzle is that 6 years after her disappearance, a man named William came forward with a confession that after Emma was last seen, he picked her up from the side of the road because it was raining and he wanted to help her. Upon request, he gave her a ride to Colwood, a town that was nearby to the hotel area where she was last seen. William told police that she had requested him to take her there to meet a friend. If this story is true, it would make William the last person to have ever seen Emma, but it also means that Emma didn't go missing in the area of the Empress Hotel, but somewhere in Colwood. Overall, this is a truly sad disappearance and is still currently unsolved. If you have any leads or want to contribute to the search, there's actually still multiple online communities for you to help in, with one of them being Help Find Emma Fillipoff on Facebook or r/Find Emma Fillipoff on Reddit. With that being said, I hope Emma is found safely soon. I really hate to end this video on such an upsetting note, but I did say this video got scarier as it went on. I guess the silver lining is that there is still hope in the Emma Fillipoff case. With that being said, that's going to conclude our first ever video on unsolved mysteries. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the small variety of strange entities, strange occurrences, disappearances, and missing items. I tried to keep this video diverse, and I tried to keep it interesting too, with stories that I haven't heard before. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you want more videos on unsolved mysteries, I'd be happy to do it. And if you'd like this video, why not watch this video about what war was like in every time period? It's a pretty good watch. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro.